phase. So if there's that and I've missed, just make sure you try and get your questions in before we log off. But my contact details are going to be on all the slides in the footer anyway. So if there's something you wanted to ask but didn't get to, get in touch. So a little bit about myself, do a bit of background before we get going. I have a bachelor's degree in food science and health, which I did in Limerick. Went on then to study dietetics, so I am a dietitian. And at the moment, I'm in the middle of a master's degree in sports and exercise nutrition. So education and professional development are very, very important for even for sports nutrition, because anything I suggest, you know, it has a direct impact on your dietary preferences and choices, which then in turn affect your health. So really, really important to have a good grasp of the mechanisms behind everything I'm saying. So on top of that, then I actually was an international race walker. So I have a bit of an insight into what it's like to be an athlete, and it's why I like to work predominantly with endurance athletes. And at the moment, I'm working with a couple of guys who either are Olympic athletes or they're on their way to Tokyo. And then there's athletes from all various sports, like professional cyclists, international marathon runners, professional rowers, triathletes, you name it. I've probably worked with someone in the sport. So enough about me. I'm going to get into the talk, and basically what's on the agenda today is how can we keep good habits during a time of change. So obviously with COVID now, I suppose the whole dynamic of our day has changed. So how can we make sure we're nice and consistent during this time frame? Then there's going to be a couple of considerations to take into account for eating around exercise. We're going to look at fueling before, during, and after exercise, and a little bit about hydration, and then we're going to jump into the Q&A at the end. So that's kind of the skeleton outline of what we're going to do. If you have questions outside of this, again, put them to the end and I will try and get to them. Okay, so during COVID, like for most people, this is a totally unprecedented time. And with something like that, you know, there's no rules per se, like no one really knows how to act. And as a result, you know, people aren't really being held to any kind of standard. Like it's perfectly acceptable at the moment to stay in your pajamas till 2 or 3 o'clock in the day. Like there's a very low bar. And when things like that happen, sometimes we allow our own standards to drop, you know. And this is particularly relevant for athletes when you're not in a competitive environment anymore. There's no races on the line. It can be a little bit easy to lose your motivation, and you're not really comparing yourself to other people unless you're glued to Strava, that is. So keeping up good habits in a time like this is very, very important. Whilst nutrition at like on the day or on a decision to decision basis doesn't feel like it's making the biggest difference in the world, because it's not as say impactful or tangible as going for a run. You know, you don't suddenly feel tired, or you don't see like new muscles appearing when you make a good dietary choice. It's all very underwhelming. It can be easy to forget about it on a day-to-day basis. So a couple of tips for keeping on top of what you need to be doing during COVID. Number one, you need a new approach. If you're someone who needs routine, and routine can be a little bit of a trigger for you to do things, like I know busy college athletes and leaving cert students, they just do everything like clockwork because they have to. But you know, my grandmother used to say to me, you'll take the amount of time you have to do something. So if you suddenly have all the spare time in the day, you'll probably find you're not eating so routinely or regimented. So the first thing that I have got a couple of people to do, set an alarm, or just at the start of the day write out a little bit of a routine or schedule. It can be as loose as I need to have dinner around this time, breakfast around this time, and I'll do something to fill up the space in between. If you have some kind of structure on your day, at least you're not just kind of drifting off into vagueness. So that's step one. I know it seems silly almost, but it's really important that you keep a routine going. Writing it down is the best way to do it. Step two, then go for low-hanging fruits. If you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by all of the things you could do with your nutrition, because let's face it, there are hundreds of things you could be doing. You could eat your veg, you could go for whole grain products, you could try taking protein powder, you could take a supplement. Go for low-hanging fruit, excuse the pun. Just do really easy things. If you're trying to make a start, don't go straight for like complex sports nutrition or starting to periodize your carbohydrate intake, just add an extra 2 or 3 portions of veg to your day. Simple as. Maybe start to control your carbohydrate portions, maybe swap out a bar of chocolate for a piece of fruit. Simple stuff. Just actually doing it makes a big difference. Then on from that, when you start doing, say, the simple things or like the real basics, what I like to get people to do is, for example, I will never tell someone, don't have this. So I never kind of have negative reinforcement. Basically, what we would do in turn is, say you make a good decision, you have like a banana as a snack instead of a Mars bar or a couple of biscuits. Thing to do there is acknowledge, okay, I've made a good decision here. This is good for me. It's good for my goals. I'm perfectly in control of my health, and this is benefiting me, and I did it on purpose. Good for me. That's kind of the way I like to get people to meditate on it. So in a sense, what we're doing is making positive feedback loops around, I suppose, beneficial behavior, as opposed to trying avoid the elephant in the room. I hope that makes sense. I can't actually see people's reactions, but I hope I've explained that okay. So basically, acknowledge when you're doing something positive, congratulate yourself for it. Don't try and avoid chocolate. Don't have that your conscious effort for the day. It's not I must avoid X, Y, and Z. The challenge is, how much good food can I eat, or how many good decisions I can make on a day-to-day basis. That's a real subtle but powerful driver for you making good decisions, because you're making a game out of it. Final point there, think of this as extra time. Nutrition is often something that's just an afterthought for a lot of people, which is a shame, because correctly implemented nutrition, say over the span of a season for an athlete, it can make all the difference in the world. If you're not recovering properly, if you're not hydrating properly, if you're looking to gain a little bit of lean muscle mass or make sure your nutrient requirements are met, all those things, they ebb and they flow, and your needs shift throughout the phases of a season. And if you're not on top of it, you're just losing out on gains you didn't really know you could get. So everyone now has like a little bit of extra time where, there's, the stakes are low. It's, you thought you were going to have a race season this summer, but focus on your weaknesses. And in my few years of working with people, nutrition is a unilateral weakness among the athletic populations, whether they like to admit it or not. It just is. So use this time to start nailing the basics. Get your protein intake in, nail your hydration. If you're an endurance athlete, maybe start implementing some fat-fueled workouts. Definitely the tough stuff, you need to have your carbs for that, and make sure your micronutrients are met. If you do that, you're well on the way. These things are all explained in the slides, by the way, so just they're coming up. So considerations for fueling for exercise. So basically what this slide is about is, let's say hypothetically, I'm going to do a training session in 3 hours time, and when I'm done this presentation, I want to have a meal. What are the thoughts that should go into my head before I decide what to eat? I should think about what kind of exercise it is. Is it a tough workout? Is it a really easy workout? If it's a tough workout, I might want to avoid some fiber-rich foods and fat-rich foods, because my intestines will be under a little bit of pressure to digest them, and I might feel ill. If it's an easy workout, I maybe don't need to have such a humongous carbohydrate portion before I go. What are your goals? If your goals are to, extract the maximum metabolic adaptations from a session, if it's an easy workout like low VO2 efforts, things like that, you might opt to go fat fueled. That has some benefits over carb fueled work for stimulating something called mitochondrial biogenesis. So basically, if you do it often enough, carefully, and I'll explain that later, you kind of tack on points to your VO2 max, but it's not something you would do for a tough workout. So if your goals are to be the most efficient endurance athlete, you might look to start implementing things like that. But if you're a thrower, a sprinter, a 400-meter runner, probably not super relevant for that. What's your phase of training? Are you in, say, preparation, like winter training, or is it race season? The answer is it's race season. You should look to make sure your protein needs are met, that you might want to include some ergogenic aids like caffeines or sodium bicarbonates or beetroot juices, things like that. Things that you just kind of want to familiarize yourself with for race day, but not necessarily want to rely on for your sessions all year round. I think I have this later on in the slides as well, but if you have questions on that, just ask. So basically, to recap on this slide, think about the training you're doing, what the purpose of that session is, and how that might influence your food choices. It usually boils down to fat-fueled meal, carb-fueled meal, low fiber, low fat meal. That's kind of it. I hope that makes sense. So I just have it here. You might offer a fat fuel session if it's low intensity, it's under 60 minutes, you don't have a tough session the next day, or it's not, say, a day where you're doing double training sessions. Fat fueled work really depletes your glycogen levels, and that's a problem because that will suppress your immune system in return and hamper your recovery and, say, your ability to tolerate and execute a tough session within 24 hours of doing that. So if you're someone who trains every day, you wouldn't do a fat fuel session the day before or the day after your toughest workout of the week. So there's a couple of caveats you have to kind of stick onto the fat fuel session. Fat oxidation typically peaks around 65-70% your max heart rate. So if you're even doing like moderate aerobic efforts, probably not appropriate to do it fat fueled. So there's kind of there's real small parameters where that's appropriate and where it's not. So just think about that. You might offer a carb fuel session if it's a gym workout and you're doing explosive stuff. It's a circuit class. You have a tempo session or, say, intervals, or it's a race. You definitely want carbs for that. Reason being, the higher the intensity, think of this as a ladder. The higher you go up the intensity ladder, the more you rely on, say, glycolytic sources, so carbohydrates. Essentially, you're not able to metabolize fats quick or efficiently enough to match a high energy output. So if you have a tough session and you kind of want to nail it and do as well as you possibly could, you should probably go for the carbohydrates. So that's really, really important. And it's more important in, say, competition phase of training not to be doing the fat fueled workouts again, because if you're on a fat fueled workout, it suppresses your glycogen. It wouldn't be a good thing to do in, say, a race week. You do not want to suppress your glycogen levels in race week. The other benefit for a carb fuel session is you take on some high GI carbs. So high GI basically is you absorb them very, very rapidly. What that'll do is it'll slightly rise your insulin levels and it'll stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So what that means basically, it's kind of like muscle insurance, if you want to think of it like that. So if you're stimulating muscle protein synthesis, it's not physically possible for you to break down or lose any muscle. So say if you're a power athlete or a sprinter and you're looking to pack on lean mass, it doesn't make sense to do fasted or fat-fueled workouts. If you're looking to maximize your recovery, it also doesn't make sense to do that. So the last part of this pie is ergogenic aids. So if you don't know what an ergogenic aid is, it's basically a fancy word for sports supplement. So the main ones would be creatine monohydrate, caffeine, beta-alanine, sodium bicarbonate, and beetroot juice. Those are the big five. Before training, you might look to have a caffeine or coffee. Reason being is if you take in some caffeine, and I have the dosages and the timing a little bit later on, what it can do is it can make your perception of fatigue a little bit dampened, so you're not going to feel the fatigue as much as you might. And it can also make it easier for you to coordinate kind of complex neurological movements. So why is this relevant? When you get to, say, in race walking, I know, for example, most of the cards are handed out at around 70% of the race. So if it's a 20K between kilometers 14 and 15, that's where a lot of the cards and disqualifications happen. The screws start to come loose, you're a little bit tired, you're not going to be so diligent with your technique. The same could be said, say, the concentration required for maximal sprinting, for jumping, for throwing, hurdling, anything that's kind of difficult to coordinate, you would do well to include some caffeine beforehand. You wouldn't want to do it for every session though, because you can build up a bit of a tolerance to it. So how I would say pick and choose when I have caffeine, it will be before the key session of the week, once or twice a week, and that will be it before your session. That's how you get the maximal benefit out of it. If you're relatively new to running, or you're not like, say, a highly trained athlete, you might look to try beetroot juice if you want to squeeze some extra benefit from your endurance session. So those beeted shots are the most common way of getting it. That can improve your VO2 max and aerobic efficiency a little bit if you take it about 2 hours before training. But bear in mind, this doesn't really work if you're a well-trained athlete. So the more of a training age and training background you have, the less efficient beetroot juice will be. But if you're getting ready for like your first marathon, or like you want to nail a local 10K and it's your first time doing it, trying beetroot juice in 2 or 3 long runs before race day will be a good way to try it, just to see if you're able to tolerate it, because it's not the nicest, and it can play up on your stomach a little bit. The last ones I mentioned there are creatine. Timing doesn't really matter for that, so you wouldn't be having it before training. And then there's 2 lactic acid buffers, beta-alanine and sodium bicarbonate. This is only really relevant for sprinters and throwers, so I'm not really going to go through it there, because most people watching this are endurance athletes. But if you have questions about it, ask at the end or get in touch with me, and I will answer them for you. So I hope that all makes sense. The point I want to get across is you shouldn't have one standard meal before training. You shouldn't look at every session as the same thing. Think about what's my goal on race day? What kind of athlete am I? What adaptation do I want to squeeze from this training session? And that should inform your food choices. So I hope this slide makes sense. It's very, very important. So this, to be honest, I've just kind of described this slide, but I'm going to put some food choices around it now. So if you're opting for a carb meal before a training session, personally, what I would do, I would have it around 2 to 3 hours before I go, and I would keep it to, say, simpler carbs, or at least not wholemeal products. So I might go for the likes of a baked potato or 2, a large bowl of pasta, white pasta, or a large bowl of white rice. If I'm in a rush, I might have the likes of a white bagel with some jam. Basically, simple carbohydrates, low in fiber. And you might ask, why am I going for low fiber foods? The reason being, when you start exercising, even low intensity, the blood is shunted away from your intestines, and you release some hormones in your guts that reduce your motility and gastric emptying rate. So if you have things like fibers or fats that take a long time to digest, you might have some bloating, some stomach pain, even diarrhea or vomiting. This is particularly true if you're doing intense work or ultra endurance stuff. So meal before a training session, it shouldn't really be quote unquote healthy eating guidelines. You know, that's not where you want to have all the vegetables and all the fiber. Save that for everything after training. That's usually what I recommend to people, to limit the likes of runners' trots or being doubled over in stomach pain. It used to happen to me a lot. I never understood why. And, you know, I was subscribing to the food pyramid, which is great for general population, but for before, during, and after training, the healthy eating guidelines don't really apply. So just keep that in mind. Secondly, then, if you're going for a fat fuel session, you have 2 choices here. If it's, say, first thing in the morning, you can simply get up, roll out of bed and do it. That's a fat fuel session because you've been fasting all night and you're going to have very low or no glycogen levels left. So that's one option if you're an early morning riser. I am not, because I have a very small baby who doesn't allow me to do things like that. So I have to train, say, in the middle of the day or in the evening time. If I was going for a fat fuel session, say early afternoon, I might make my breakfast something like an omelette or some scrambled egg with maybe 1 piece of turkey bacon and some avocado. That's a pretty satiating low carb meal, and it's not going to, say, jump in the way of the training adaptation you want from a fat fuel session. So that's how I would do that. Then point 3 on this slide, ergogenic aids. If I was going to have a coffee, or if I was going to have some caffeine, what I want is 0.5 milligram of caffeine per kilogram of body weight, okay? So I'm going to explain what that means. I'm 80 kilos. So for me to get a performance benefit, I have to have 40 milligrams of caffeine. So a standard cup of tea, like this, that has 40 milligrams of caffeine in it. So if you weigh less than 80 kilos, a cup of tea will be enough to give you that performance benefit you want. If you want something a little bit stronger, a cup of coffee has 80 milligrams. So do the likes of Red Bulls and Monster Energies. They all have 80 milligrams of caffeine in them and will definitely be enough to give you that performance benefit. If you are going for caffeine, take it about 45 minutes before your session or race starts. That's how long it takes for it to peak in your bloodstream. So when I finish my cup of tea, for example, it's 25 past 12 now. It might be around 5 past 1, 10 past 1 by the time it's kind of at its peak levels in my blood where it's most useful to me. And caffeine has a half-life of about 6 hours. So it'll stay at that high level for 6 hours, basically. So that's really the main one you'd want to look at before training. If you're going to try the beetroot juice, you're looking to get a beetroot shot or 300 mils of beetroot juice 2 hours before training. It takes 2 hours for the nitric oxide to peak in your blood. So if you're doing a long run, say at the weekend, 2 hours before you start, that's when you take it in. If anyone has questions on that, just divert them to the Athletics Ireland account. They'll be relayed to me and I will answer them at the end. Okay, so I'm going to move on. If you're carb fueling, I had briefly touched on this, but this is an important slide. 1 to 1.5 grams of carbohydrates per kg of body weight, 2 to 3 hours before training. So for me, if I'm looking at a meal that has 80 grams of carbohydrates in it, I might go for a bowl of oats, so maybe 50, 60 grams of oats, some low-fat milk, and I might put some honey on top or maple syrup. That'll hit me my 80 grams, or I might have a bagel with jam and a small glass of juice. That's how I would do that. And all of those things will fit in the high GI category, more or less. If you're finding yourself that you're getting a little bit hungry, or you have to leave your main meal 4 hours more before your training session, you might look to get a little snack in 30 minutes before you start, just to keep the peckishness at bay. Exercise will kind of dampen your appetite anyway as a result of a hormone called GABA. It's released when you exercise. So if you are hungry, that will go away, but you shouldn't ignore your hunger. And if it has been maybe more than 3 hours, 4 hours between your last meal and a training session, having the likes of a banana or some dried apricots or dates 30 minutes before you get going is probably a good idea. And you're looking maybe to get a 25, 30 gram dose of carbohydrates. So that basically would look like standard banana, 5 or 6 dried apricots, and 4 or 5 dates. Those are all high GI as well. They shouldn't really impact on your tummy. There's not too much fiber in them. It's just, again, simple sugars. And again, the carbohydrate protocol, this is best for tough sessions and key sessions that you kind of want to nail so you can get the most out of them and set yourself up for kind of a good recovery platform. So I'm going to move on from that. If you're going to do a fat fueling session, as I said, you only really want to do this if it's low intensity and less than 65 minutes. You can include very low GI carbs if you want a fat fuel breakfast, for example. So what I might have is 1 slice of, say, wholemeal seeded bread, and I might put a little bit of butter on it. That's very low GI. So because I'm having maybe the bread and an egg, maybe some avocado, that's going to release so slowly that any carbohydrates in it that get released into my bloodstream, it's not going to cause any insulin, say, level rises, and it's not going to, say, affect my fat adaptive response or my muscle protein synthesis. So think of it like this. When you have fat fueled workouts, you have, say, the mitochondrial biogenesis response. If it's a carb fueled workout, you have an anabolic response. They're antagonistic. So if your insulin level rises, you're not really going to be able to do a fat fueled workout, basically. So that's why low GI carbs specifically in a very small portion. So I hope that makes sense. And you'll be looking to have that meal 2 or 3 hours before you go. And that's good for easy sessions or kind of your longer sessions. That's how I would do that. If you want to mix these approaches, and again, this is kind of summarizing what we would have talked about already, but for my clients, I get them to maybe do 2 or 3 fat fueled workouts a week, and we'll periodize this. So for their morning recovery sessions or their rest days, this is when they'll do this type of stuff. We'll use carbs for tougher sessions, and a cheeky way you can get both benefits is doing something called delayed feeding. So if you're a marathon runner, a race walker, or an ultra endurance athlete, if you're, like, say, going out for a long session on a Sunday morning, get up first thing in the morning, maybe have an Americano with no sugar, go, and wait an hour before you start fueling. So you might take a gel or a sports drink. You get an hour into your session on fat fueled, so you'll get that adaptive response you want, and then you'll start feeding. So you're not going to totally, say, plummet your glycogen levels down, and you're not totally, say, impacting on the integrity of your session or how well it could go. So delayed feeding is a good way to do that. And a lot of professional cyclists I'm working with, they'll do stuff like that as well, and they find it very, very useful. It's just a way to kill 2 birds with the 1 stone. But again, if you're like a 5 or a 10K runner, odds are your sessions aren't really ever going to be long enough to do this. So this is only really applicable for guys who have sessions that are 90 minutes at least or more, ideally 2 hours plus. So I hope that makes sense. I've gone through that. I'm not going to zip through the ergogenic aids again, but those are the numbers there, just if you wanted to look at them. This, from what I understand, will be put on YouTube. So if you're looking for these numbers, you'll be able to find this online anyway. So during training, this is an interesting thing we can do to improve your performance a lot. Most people's jaws drop when I tell them that when they're exercising, especially if it's 60 minutes or more, that they probably need to be taking in 500 to 600 mils of fluid per hour, simply to just match your sweat rate. And I'm going to talk about hydration later on, but this is fierce important, especially if you're looking to perform optimally, if it's a tough session or if it's hot. Like, I'm looking out here now, it's not too hot at the moment, but we had hot weather the last few days, and I know from my clients checking in who did and who didn't nail their hydration based on how their training went. I could tell. So hydration is one aspect of it. If you're doing anything over 75 minutes in duration, you're probably going to have to start fueling on the go. So the best way to do it is you're using a 2-to-1 carb source. So if you've ever looked at a gel or a sports drink, unless it says dual carb source, it's probably not the best. So what I'd be looking for is 2-to-1 ratio of maltodextrin to fructose. That's the most well tolerated like sports product you can get. It causes the least amount of symptoms. And crucially, if you're an elite athlete, what it'll do is it'll enable you to absorb the physiological max. And I'm going to run through those numbers in a minute. So if you're using a gel, you needed to say 2-to-1 carbohydrate source on it. If you're using a sports drink, you still want a powder that has that 2-to-1 source, and you want to make your drinks up to 8 to 10% solution. Anything over that, you'll risk feeling a little bit sick or vomiting. There's one key thing to avoid, say, gut problems on race day or marathon day if you're going to be implementing fueling guidelines. It's practice. That's actually the biggest determinant in how well you tolerate something. Your intestinal physiology actually changes if you start feeding carbohydrates during training. You actually get an increase in the expression of carbohydrate receptors, so you get more of them, you get better at it, which is actually, I think it's pretty cool. But you know, I read studies for fun, so I might my idea of cool could be a little bit out of sync with norm, but it is interesting. Another interesting element here is if you're doing, say, a tough session and it's under 60 minutes in duration, and say you want to try and force yourself to get that fat adaptative response, simply having the likes of a Lucozade Sport or High 5 Energy in a bottle and doing a mouth rinse and just spitting it out, not actually swallowing it, that actually has a beneficial impact on performance. So what that basically shows is there is a psychological element at play in terms of, say, fatigue, sensation, and responses. So if you have a session under 60 minutes long and it's a tough session, you can do your carb mouth rinsing and you'll still do a good session and you can still get that fat adaptative response. So that's just a little thing there to think about. And, you know, for some people who want to try it, it's a good way of marrying up those two adaptative pathways. So then if we're looking at how many carbohydrates do you want to take in, if you're just going easy and you're just trying to get used to it, 30 grams an hour would be the bare minimum I would set for guys or girls racing. So that's usually okay for an event that's under 90 minutes in duration, mainly because normal glycogen levels, they last for 140 minutes, which is why, say, in a marathon, a lot of people will hit the wall at around 100 minutes in. And for some people, that's when they get to maybe mile 13, 14, 15, depending on how fast you're running, obviously. But you only have a finite amount of glycogen. So if your event is shorter, you just kind of need less carbohydrates to reduce the likelihood of running out, basically. So the longer your event is, the more you'd need to take in. If you're a marathon runner, you'd be looking at ideally getting 60 to 70 grams an hour, which basically looks like 2 gels or a gel and a handful of gummy bears or something like that. They tend to be pretty well tolerated on the road. For elite athletes, 90 grams an hour is kind of that's the gold standard. It's easy to do with like the likes of a race walker. They're going around a 2 kilometer loop. They have access to bottles every 8 to 9 minutes religiously. If you're a cyclist, same thing. If you're a marathon runner or you're doing a half marathon, you know, odds are you're on like this loop that goes around the city and there's scenic routes and you might only have access to a bottle every 3 miles. So for those guys, it's kind of a tough thing to match up. So you'd be looking at maybe carrying a couple of gels, placing a few friends along the course and having them swap gels with you. So that's a hard one to manage logistically, but you know, people manage. That 90 grams an hour though, and the 2-to-1 carb source ratio, why they're important in your intestines. You have 2 different types of carbohydrate receptors, SGLT1 and GLUT5. So the likes of glucose-derived sugars like maltodextrin, you can absorb approximately 60 grams an hour of them from your intestines. And in your GLUT5 receptors, you can absorb about 30 grams of fructose. So there's a 2-to-1 absorption ratio there. That's why 2-to-1 on a sports product is very, very important. And if you're an athlete trying to, say, max out how many carbs you get in the door, you need to do a 2-to-1 or you won't be able to hit that 90 grams an hour. So that's why that's really important. So if maximum performance is your goal and you have maybe experienced hitting the wall before, this is probably something you would want to look at. So post-training, how can we make sure you nail your recovery? This often surprises people actually where my focus would be with the guys I'm working with. Easiest thing to do, within 20 minutes of finishing, and maybe just have something in your gear bag, you want 0.5 gram of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight. That's what the evidence suggests is the best thing. So for me, I'd be looking for a 40-gram dose of carbohydrates. So I might have a banana and maybe the likes of a flat white, because ingesting caffeine after training can help with this recovery process. So why does 20 minutes matter? Basically, when you exercise, you get an increase in, say, glucose transport and your insulin sensitivity increases. So for all intents and purposes, anything you eat essentially gets hoovered up by your cells and it gets almost shuttled straight away to your glycogen stores. So glycogen repletion is one of the measures of how recovered you are. And it turns out that the more your glycogen is restored, the better you are at completing, say, subsequent exercise bouts and tolerating the workload in a tough session. So that's lots of words. The 20 minutes then came from, they looked at people who timed their post-training recovery differently. People who had these carbohydrates within 20 minutes and people who didn't. If you had athlete A within 20 minutes and athlete B not, and they have the same amount of carbohydrates, 24 hours later, athlete A's glycogen levels are 66% higher than athlete B. So they're much more ready to do the tough session. They're much better recovered. They have less immune suppression. So that's really, really important. And that 20-minute really matters. And that 0.5 gram of carbohydrates per kg of body weight really, really matters. Caffeine can help ameliorate that process and make it higher again. So if you get it in within 20 minutes, then you can chill, you can shower, you can get dressed, you can do whatever and get to a meal when you can. There's no real major rush on you if you can get that initial burst in as soon as possible. For your meal post-training then, you're looking at getting 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrates. So again, I'm an 80 kilo man and I'm not going to have porridge for my dinner after a training session. So what does an 80 grams of carbohydrates meal look like? It could be 1 large baked potato. And if I was going for veggies, then I might have some peas. They're very high in carbs. I might have some broccoli and maybe some beans as well. And I would have a lean protein source. So going for the starchy carbohydrates and a baked potato, that gets me my 80 grams. That's my recovery kind of locked up and nailed right there. One thing that often surprises people around post-training recovery is that the protein doesn't really matter as much as you might think. So the evidence has been pretty clear that for, say, muscle recovery, which is not what I'm talking about here, I'm talking about glycogen recovery, that whole idea of the anabolic window has been widely disregarded in sports nutrition research and literature. The most important thing, understand what your needs are. So for an endurance athlete, it's around 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kg per day. So for me, I'm a 96 to 110 grams a day, roughly, candidate. So what I would need to do is make sure I just get that in over the course of the day. That's much more important than in relation to training when I eat my protein. So if you focus on bigger picture, you will fare better in general. Couple of points on nailing muscle protein synthesis, as I know that was a question I got. If you want it to be optimal, and I say it like that because sometimes optimal isn't practical, eating, say, a high biological value protein every 3 hours is the best way to do that. So what does high biological value look like? Something dairy derived, maybe a whey protein, maybe a fulfill bar, milk, cheese, yogurt. You could look at eggs and any kind of fish or meat source. Those things all have 20 amino acids in them, which is why I'm suggesting them. If you're a plant-based athlete, you would want to start getting, say, complementary protein sources. So you might look to have some legumes and maybe some grains, or if you're having the likes of pulses, you might want to have grains with it as well, just so you get your 20 amino acids in. In general, plant proteins lack something called branched chain amino acids, the main one being leucine. So leucine, and I know I'm kind of gone on a bit of a biochemistry tangent here, but this is important and I'll wrap it all up into a practical thing you can do. Leucine is the amino acid that's most linked with muscle protein synthesis. So for optimal levels of muscle protein synthesis or muscle growth, you want to get 2 to 2.5 grams of leucine every 3 hours. You can do that very easily by having any of the sources I previously mentioned, the dairy, eggs, meat, fish sources. Or if you're a plant-based athlete, what I sometimes get them to do is to have a little scoop of BCAAs, branched chain amino acids, with their meals. That's literally the only time that that's appropriate. So if you can eat close to every 3-4 hours, get a protein source there, don't worry about getting a protein shake in after your training. It won't benefit you. So just put that one to bed. I'm sure there's going to be questions about that. It's often the way when something has just been an unquestioned belief for so long that anything contrary to that, there's usually uproar. But it's not my opinion, it's what the literature says. So carbohydrates should be your aim after training. So last topic then we're going to look at, because we're actually at 45 minutes already, hydration. So why is hydration so important? I'm going to talk about why it's important first, although I have the points kind of worked out a little bit differently. 1% dehydration. So for me, that's 0.8 of a kilogram lost in sweat. And just to note what that feels like, it's not very tangible or noticeable. For example, if you're thirsty, you are 1% dehydrated 30 minutes ago. If your urine is starting to get discolored or yellow, you are at least 2 or 3% dehydrated. And that response is a delayed response because your kidneys have to react to excrete less water if you're dehydrated. So your hypothalamus is in charge of regulating this, and your body doesn't necessarily react or prompt you to take action for a while. It's not like instantaneous. So basically 1, 2, 3% dehydration. You don't really feel any different if you're sitting down at rest. You might feel thirsty, you might have dark urine. Why is it important? 1% dehydration results in a 10% drop in aerobic performance for 3 days. That's absolutely huge. If you're on 2 or 3%, then that goes maybe to 20%, 30%. It's pretty exponential and pretty devastating on sports performance. Those are all arbitrary numbers. If you want a practical number, every percentage point of dehydration you have, your core temperature rises by 1/4 degrees Celsius. So bear in mind, in clinical settings, if your core temperature rises by about 1 degree, your class is having a fever. So if we then look at someone doing a 10K, a 20K walk, a half marathon, they're sweating, it's hot, they're getting hotter. If your core temperature is rising and you're dehydrated, the main thing that's happening is your blood flow is going to the surface of your skin to cool you down. That's our mechanism for keeping cool. Hydration will help with this, but you have to keep your core temperature down too. And why that's important is if your blood is going to the surface of your skin, it's not in your muscles. So it's being shunted away from where the oxygen is required. That's where you get your oxygen from. So that 10% performance decrease, it's basically you'll start hitting lactate at 10%, say below where you normally would. And in terms of, say, a 50K walk, for example, that could mean 25 minutes of the difference. If you're a standard marathon runner, you're 3 hours plus, that could be 15, 20 minutes down the road that you've slowed down by not paying attention to this. So how can we monitor our hydration? Thirst and urine color are poor ways to do it, and that's what we typically do. You can't really monitor it. The best thing to do is preempt it. Like, you can't see this here, but I always have a bottle of water, this sparkling water, at my foot or in my hand, and I just have it ingrained in my behavior that I drink something, just a sip, every 15, 20 minutes. Because if you feel thirsty, you're already dehydrated. You've already taken away from your sports performance potential. So definitely one to look out for, particularly in summer months, and particularly for endurance athletes who are relying predominantly on aerobic output capacity. So the numbers then, if you're looking to stay properly hydrated, you're looking at 35 mils per kilogram per day. So for me, 80 kilo dude, it's approximately, I'm doing the maths off the top of my head here, it's approximately 2.6, 2.7 liters a day, plus 500 to 600 mils per hour of exercise. So I don't know what all you guys weigh, but you know yourself, multiply your weight by 35. That's how much you need on a rest day. And you're adding in 500 to 600 mils per hour of exercise then. If it's hot, you might look to add a little bit extra. So in training then, ideally what you're looking for is a sports drink. The reason being is that the presence of glucose or sugars and sodium, they will help draw water into your system better than water alone. And it's even shown with, say, a very low solution or a 3% sports drink, it'll actually work to rehydrate you better than water itself. So that's why sports drinks exist. They provide superior hydration than water alone. And so that's really, really important. One thing you probably don't need to do is to start supplementing with electrolyte tablets or like those diurolite sachets. Most people don't need them unless you're training for like 4 hours plus per day. Usually you don't start losing the likes of magnesiums and sodiums and chlorides in your sweat until you're a few hours in. The only one you're going to lose in appreciable amounts would be sodium. And if you have a Western diet, you already get twice the sodium that you're supposed to. If you're having a sports drink, you're replacing your sodium anyway. So what I get people to do is after a session, particularly if it's hot, just sprinkle or crack some salt onto 1 or 2 meals a day. Again, that's not a healthy eating guideline. That's the opposite to what's suggested. But if you have a high exercise, say, load, it's probably a good idea to do something like that. With hydration, it's not just about, say, the concentration of your blood. It's also about the concentration of electrolytes. If they flux at all, there's serious ramifications to that. So those are the numbers. Stick to them as well as you can. If you need help with anything, I've gone through in the slides. Just my contacts are down there, website, Twitter handle, Instagram handle. Just get in touch with me and I'll answer the questions. I have no problem doing that. So that's everything for today. If I had 2 or 3 hours and people with very long attention spans, I would go much longer. But if you have questions, pop them to the AAI account there and they'll be relayed to me. I have a few questions here that I'm going to go through for the next few minutes. So if I've answered your question, some of them are a little bit repetitive, but I'll go through them as I'm going down. So first one that came in there, would I recommend taking collagen protein for Achilles tendonitis? Probably not. Tendonitis is inflammation, not necessarily actual structural tissue damage. So collagen and vitamin C supplementation, 10 grams a day, is recommended if you have connective tissue damage. So a tear or a fracture or something like that, not necessarily for tendonitis. For tendonitis, I might recommend, once the initial inflammation has settled down, that you make sure your intake of omega-3 is around 2.5 grams a day, and that you're getting, say, varied sources of antioxidants. So what I would say is eat the rainbow. I know that sounds a little bit childish, but the antioxidants and the omega-3s will help hamper any unwarranted inflammation that are just kind of causing you pain and that might be getting in the way or frightening you from rehabbing properly. But no to the collagen on that one. So what is a good fuel and refuel snack for children? Pretty much the guidelines back there. This is for 11, 12, 13-year-old kids. If I had, say, when my daughter's 11, she's a little bit younger than that now, but when she's 11 and she's going exercising, what I might do is get her to have a bowl of pasta or maybe a baked potato 2 hours before training, leave her go training, and when she's finished, because she's a child, I might give her a few Haribo jellies or some confectionery snakes. As I said, it's not healthy eating guidelines before, during, and after training. It's simple sugars. That's what's best for recovery and fueling. So that's what I would do. I would make it like a useful time to give them a treat. I'm very much of the opinion that kind of a balanced, moderate approach is better than, say, the hashtag clean eating. I'm really not into that kind of stuff. I hope that answers the question. Be great to hear my views on a paleo and keto diets. So I'm not really into any diet, to be honest. All diets really, I have to be politically correct here. All diets, they wrap up the same thing in a different marketing Trojan horse. So most diets will do the following: make you eat more vegetables, probably make you cut out processed stuff, probably make you cut out alcohol, and as a result, you subconsciously pay more attention to your sleep, activity levels, and portion control. Some things like a paleo diet, a ketogenic diet, vegan plant-based diets, they'll just cut out a lot of the crap just by virtue of the parameters that are set around them. It's very hard to kind of have that traditional Western diet and those hyper-palatable junk foods if you're subscribing to a dietary mechanism. So I'm not really for any one diet. At the moment, I have 4 athletes ranging in, I suppose, ability and level, professional to international to recreational, on high-fat diets, not necessarily ketogenic. There is a difference. A ketogenic diet would be less than 20 grams of carbohydrates a day. A high-fat diet is where more than 70% of your energy is from fats. I have a few guys on that at the moment because they're doing easy training and because their sporting goals will benefit from doing just a very short period of a high fat diet, but it's never a year round thing. So yeah, I'm not a fan of the anything diet. When I'm working with someone, my approach is, well, what works for you? You know, healthy eating guidelines are they're the basics we build off of, and there's maybe 200 ways we could do any diet for any one person, and it would still be right. So it's about what works for the person, not necessarily which diet you camp to subscribe to. And one of the problems there is all of these diets will work, and usually most people's measure for a dietary's efficacy is weight loss. So all diets can lead to weight loss. And, you know, if person A believes diet X is the best and person Y believes diet W is the best, from their own like personal experience, they're both right, because maybe they both tried it, it was good for them. This is one of the reasons you see lots of arguments on like social media and Facebook, and why there's so much contradictory information. A lot of people who write it miss the point that, yes, this is one way of doing it, it's not necessarily the best way. So that's my view. They're useful if, you know, if it works for the person, although I would shy away from a ketogenic diet, to be honest. Most people who do it, they'll make poor